that. First, it has no military power. That's something we sort of lose sight of, but it just doesn't have that compared to anything like the United States. But much more importantly, secondly, Europe continues to lag far behind the United States technologically. And that really is because, again, the European societies are not immigrant societies, right? They're much more closed, and they have a problem attracting the best and brightest. And in some ways, Europe has the worst of all immigration worlds in a sense, because it does have some immigrants, but it has a lot of very poor refugees and these enclaves or pockets of unassimilated, very poor, often Muslim immigrants. But it has not been able to attract, the people from Korea and China or India that it's, actually kind of consciously tried to pick up. So to wrap up, I guess I would say that I am, I tend to be pretty critical of the book, but I think I'm more upbeat than most people at this point. Many, both abroad and domestically, believe that the United States is clearly in decline and indeed no longer a hyperpower. I'm sure many of you here probably are sure that the time of U.S. dominance is over. I think that it's actually too early to know. And maybe that's because, one nice thing about writing this book is like you really get this long view of history. So the golden age of Rome spanned 100 years. Okay? And during that time, that empire experienced many abyss-like downturns, including a horrific plague that lasted forever, invasions and rebellions. Another even better analogy is Great Britain. In 1825, just after the British Empire actually entered its heyday, so very parallel to our situation, England suffered a stock market crash and then bank panic, does that sound familiar, followed by a very serious recession. But Great Britain recovered and went on to enjoy another 70 years of global dominance. Now, it's certainly possible, I don't mean to be painting a very rosy picture, it's certainly possible, maybe even most likely, that if we can't pull ourselves out of this economic mess over the next decades, that we will go back to a multipolar world order. In fact, that may well be where we're headed. But my thesis does suggest that there is no other country better suited to replace the United States. Also, if anything, the historic election of Barack Obama is actually a startling embrace of tolerance, right? So it is not the intolerance usually associated with decline. So I don't know, I've always been an optimist. I think if we can get back on track, that it's too early to assume that the American era is over. Now, there are lots of other things I'd love to talk about, but I think I'm going to just open things up for questions. The biggest question I would say, and I'm going to leave this for people to ask me, is really, should the U.S. even want to be a hyperpower, right? And we can debate this. In a sense, the bottom line of my whole book is that as a democratic hyperpower, we suffer all the costs of being a hyperpower, right? We're the object of global resentment, we're a target for the world's disaffected, everybody expects us to pull everybody else out of the economic mess, and yet we are unable to enjoy the benefits that all the past hyperpowers did. So Rome, for example, when it conquered Dacia, which is now Romania, it just went in and looted 1 million pounds of silver and gold. That was completely expected. Today, even during the Bush administration, not even the biggest hawk ever talked about piping Iraq's oil straight to Texas, at least not openly. Right? So that's just off the table. You can't just loot. So querying whether we want to be a hyperpower, and also, is it good for the world to have a hyperpower? So I'm happy to discuss this during Q&A. By way of conclusion, let me just toss out that that it's my own view, and I believe the view of most Americans, that if America is destined to remain globally dominant in the generations or decades to come, I think it should be a hyperpower not of coercion, imperialism, and military force, but rather a hyperpower of opportunity, dynamism, and moral force. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Amy. It's obviously a few millennium and many associated questions to go through, but let me just go ahead and throw it out there to the audience. Start in the back.
Thank you. this is obviously I'm the least qualified person because I don't know, but I'm asking in the spirit of Dwight Eisenhower's farewell speech about the military-industrial complex, when he was speaking of a relatively homespun, simple military complex, 1950-something.
59.
What do you think is the sophistication of today's military-industrial complex, determining which enemies we need? I mean, remember Vietnam, the world was going to come to an end if we don't win in Vietnam. And we've heard from McCain, we must win in Iraq. No one knows, and I will now conclude my question with a quote from Johnson, who was asked when he was in the morass of Vietnam, they asked him, where is the light? And he said, don't mention the light. We don't even know a tunnel. We're completely confounded. So, analogous to Afghanistan and Pakistan, how do you, with all the Obama upbeat theme, conceive of a strategic, never mind the material victory, in a situation like that, which is much worse than Vietnam, non-tunnel.
Wow, that is a huge question, and you know, honestly, I have to say it's just not really my area of expertise. There are things I'll say a few things that are related to it. I mean, if I take your point, I don't know, I think we have some points of agreement. I mean, obviously one of the upshots of my thesis is that I strongly disagreed with those just 5 or 10 years ago saying that we must, under any circumstances, keep this a unipolar world, right? The so-called neocons who said we have to preserve this kind of military dominance with a particular vision of it. I thought the book basically is saying that's exactly backwards. That's the way to ensure a downfall. Partly because of this unconventional warfare, soft power, I mean, because even the Romans actually, it's not that, I mean, the world has changed tremendously, but even the Romans knew that you can't rule the world through sheer military power alone. That's why I went to this whole thing about this glue and you know, the identification. So right off the bat, I think if I understand your question, I'm sympathetic. I mean, I think that they got it backwards, and that it's only if we stop obsessing about how to stay a hyperpower that we might accidentally remain one. Because my view is that, for better or for worse, when I'm in a good mood and feeling optimistic, I sort of feel like that if we just stop thinking about that, that actually we have this reputation for being a land of opportunity. And we long have had it, whether we deserve it or not. We've had it for a long, long time. My parents were immigrants. They came here and definitely felt that way. And that is the secret to technological. So I'm just going to kind of punt on that because I fear that I'm just not an expert on the military question.
It seems that in most of the empires that you have discussed, that no matter how tolerant they became, their leadership remained largely homogenous. And the two that came close to being exceptions here would probably be Rome and the United States. The United States, the obvious example is Obama, but you could also point to Kennedy as being an Irish Catholic. So what do you think this says about the nature of tolerance? In that it seems that there's this core that though it may be tolerant of accepting the other elements, it didn't want to be ruled by them. And then, do you see this changing?